We are going to continue talking about wakefulness and sleep. I hope that before the 50 minutes is up, I can talk about brain function during REM sleep, as well as the function or the purpose of sleep. We see different brain function during non-REM sleep and during REM sleep. So during REM sleep, we see activity increase in the pons and in the limbic system. If you remember, the limbic system is this system that has some emotional structures that are important for emotion, as well as emotionally associated memory areas. So for example, the hippocampus. We see bursts of activity in these PGO waves, these high amplitude electrical potentials that go from the pons to the geniculate to the occipital, how it gets the PGO title or name there. So the pons is, we see these random bursts of activity is what it looks like, and then it communicates on to the geniculate, this area of the thalamus, that then communicates on to the occipital lobe or the occipital cortex. We see activity decrease in certain areas as well. So in the visual cortex, we see a decrease of activity, in the motor cortex, and in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We've talked about this area before as the area that is inhibiting unwanted responses. Another area we see increase in, or areas, are the parietal and parts of the parietal and the temporal lobes. And so instead of V1, the visual cortex, being active, we are activating those visual association areas. So we might think the fusiform face area, those areas where we're actually recognizing objects, but also, as you know, sometimes, so this is REM is when we're dreaming. Sometimes we have some amount of hearing something or feeling something with our body, and so we see these other areas are active. This is to some extent saying the same thing, but in slightly different ways. First of all, I include here, your author includes this. This has actually been in almost every textbook that I've used, this painting, The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli from 1781, where this very disturbing looking creature is hanging over this very beautiful female as she sleeps. We have been curious about REM sleep and what's going on in our dreams for millennia, just like with everything else, that this kind of mind body, those kinds of questions. We've been curious about it for a long time, and that is a very kind of disturbing painting that makes us think what's happening when we're having a nightmare exactly. This is clearly, so when we go back to that idea of consciousness, this is clearly not unconsciousness, right? I mean, dreaming is something that's really different. And we're going to see, so I just talked about where we see activity, but we see the rate of cerebral blood flow, of course, is where it's going to go to where we have activity, right? We see this with why we're measuring what we're measuring with fMRIs. So it's high in those visual association areas, as I mentioned, so we're having these kinds of visual hallucinations. It's low in V1, or the visual cortex, because no visual information is actually coming in, and it's low in the prefrontal cortex. There's no real organization to our dreams. We don't seem to have any clear goal where we are keeping anything specific in mind. And it looks like, as I mentioned in the last bunch of slides, that our eye movements during REM sleep appear to follow the hallucinations that are occurring as part of our dreams. Animals maintain a nearly constant amount of PGO waves every day. So one of the things, they have done studies where they have made people go through a kind of prolonged period of REM deprivation, and those PGO waves start to emerge in other stages of sleep and while they're awake. Along with animals, we have seen strange behaviors suggesting that the animal is hallucinating as they're having these PGO waves. That information going back to the occipital areas. We also see in another bunch of research that this one was done on college students, this REM rebound effect, where they would wake people as soon as every time they started REM sleep. It sounds like a really annoying study, right? And then when they let them sleep through the night, they saw that more of their night was spent in REM, and they had more PGO waves during REM. And now I notice I said this with previous slides because the graphs were really showing us this, but I have this with words. So there's a relationship between serotonin and acetylcholine and whether or not we are in REM sleep. So injections of carbachol, which stimulates acetylcholine synapses, quickly moves a sleeper into REM sleep. Acetylcholine is important for wakefulness. We saw this with the figures of acetylcholine, that it was those neurons that were producing acetylcholine were active when we were awake, and active, and when we're in REM, as this is a certain state of arousal. And injections that stimulate serotonin and norepinephrine synapses interrupt REM sleep. We can pull somebody right out of REM sleep. There certainly appears to be a function and a reason for sleeping. And it appears that it helps us with energy conservation in general, so that we're conserving energy when we're not needing to use energy. And we see that animals vary on their need for how much sleep they need. And it really depends on how vulnerable are they. So I've stolen this picture from somewhere of the lions sleeping. Those really large predatory animals, we can often see them sleeping a large portion of the day. We also see animals that have good places to hide, that they sleep quite a bit more than these animals that are particularly vulnerable. So the sheep, the cow, the horse, they all sleep very little because they are large. They're really prey animals, and they're very vulnerable when they're sleeping. And I told you I was going to promote sleep as much as I possibly can. It really is important for our memory. And it looks like REM is important for our non-declarative memory. And I've said this a couple of times, but it's a really great place here because pretty soon we will talk about learning and memory. But I also sort of made a big deal on the first exam with that the hippocampus is involved in laying down new explicit memories or declarative memories. So these are memories that we can declare. When we say they are explicit, we are aware of the memory, but we also have non-declarative memories. Or this includes procedural memory, and I talked about the basal ganglia being particularly important for this kind of memory. We can think of it as muscle memory sometimes, but there's also this kind of finding patterns in things that we're not aware of exactly how we understood that pattern. And so this was a non-declarative visual discrimination task, and they trained people on the task, and then they either gave them no nap, they gave them a nap where they got slow wave sleep only, or they gave them a nap where they got slow wave sleep and REM sleep. And what they found was that with no nap, they actually do worse than at the end of the first session. Then the second session, when they're being tested, they do worse. Whether this is some kind of interference or that we need to sleep is not completely clear. With slow wave sleep only, they do about the same in the second session as they did in the first session. Okay, if they're given a nap where they have slow wave sleep and they're allowed to go into REM, we see that they do better on the task, this non-declarative visual discrimination task, after the nap that includes REM sleep. Declarative memories are also consolidated during sleep. So this is a study where they looked at either a declarative learning task where people were learning lists of paired words, and a non-declarative learning task where it was a mirror tracing. So if you've seen those mirror tracings, it'll be something like a star or whatever, but I'm looking in a mirror and tracing that way. And that's at first when you're looking in the mirror, just like when you're shaving or doing anything, we learn to do that by looking in a mirror. But usually when we're drawing a star or something, we're looking down at the paper, and everything in the mirror is reversed, right? So at first, when you start to do this task, it's very difficult. But as you practice a few times, it gets easier and easier. And that's, again, one of those implicit or non-declarative kinds of tasks. In this study, they gave people a nap where they were allowed to go into slow wave sleep. Okay, and I'm going to start with the figure on the far right, that non-declarative learning task, similar to what we saw in the visual discrimination task on the last slide. They had no help from, there was no improvement, whether they were awake or whether they got to have this nap with slow wave sleep. It doesn't appear to help. Slow wave sleep does not appear to help non-declarative memory, but this nap with slow wave sleep, they did find some help for the learning the list of paired words for the declarative learning task. So it looks like it's during slow wave sleep that our explicit declarative memories are being consolidated. Sleep helps our memory and problem solving in other ways as well. As we saw before, I'm going to jump to the bottom, but it appears that there's a correlation between sleep spindles in stage 2 and nonverbal IQ. So it looks like we're doing some processing while we're sleeping that has to do with our learning ability. We have a reanalysis of memories where that helps us with our problem solving. Some people have an aha moment while they're sleeping. I'll go ahead and give my story of I am probably one of the worst computer programmers in the world. I don't like doing it. It's like pulling teeth, and I had to do a lot of programming during graduate school. And my strategy, this is not a strategy for someone who wants to move forward quickly, obviously, but every once in a while I would just get frustrated and tired of doing what I was doing, and I'd go home and I'd take a nap. And unfortunately, I was reinforced just a few times, just enough times for me to believe that I should be napping whenever I really went into a problem when I was trying to figure out my computer programs. That is actually not a very good strategy, but I did a couple of times have these aha moments and thought, oh, I think sleeping is helping me. But people do have aha moments when they're sleeping. So one of the things, sometimes people ask me how to study for my tests and or how they should prepare, and every once in a while I do think to tell them, well, one good idea is to keep up with the work and the material as we move along, and then not cram the night before so that you can get a good night's sleep, and especially for that kind of creative thinking that you're going to want to be able to do for the extra credit questions. But just even bringing back memories, it's a very good idea to read right before you go to sleep, something that you really want to learn. One of the things I used to do when I was storytelling is I would tell my story to myself right before I went to sleep in order to lay that down in memory. Anyway, so we also see recordings from the hippocampus. They have watched people while they're learning a particular task and then while they're sleeping, and they see a particular pattern of activity when people are learning this whatever task they gave them. And then during sleep, they saw that the hippocampus several times went through that same pattern of activity more quickly than while they were awake. They went through that same pattern. The hippocampus went through that same pattern of activity forwards and backwards. So this might be another reason why we see these kinds of aha moments. We're thinking about things really in different ways. Another thing that's happening during sleep is the weakening of less useful connections. So we've talked a little bit in this class, probably not enough, about synaptic pruning, but one of the things we want is an efficiently working brain, and we want the connections that are being used to be strengthened, but we also need those connections that are not being used to be pruned away so that we can focus on the connections that are useful to us. So we see synaptic pruning, or the weakening of less useful connections during sleep as well. Crucially, sleep appears to be essential for survival. One of the pieces of evidence for this is this fatal familial insomnia. This is genetic, and it's very rare, but what they see is first, these people lose their sleep spindles and K complexes, then they lose their slow wave sleep, and they start to have only brief periods of REM sleep without the paralysis. But eventually they are just not sleeping at all. So this results in damage to the thalamus. We see deficits in attention and memory. So similar to what we start to see right when we're sleep deprived, that our cognitive skills are decreasing, and also some irritability and lack of emotional regulation. This is followed by a dreamlike, confused state. And if you remember from earlier, if we don't get our REM sleep, then REM appears to start occurring in other stages of sleep and sometimes when we're awake. So they look like they're sometimes dreaming while awake. Loss of control of autonomic and endocrine systems, increased temperature, and of course, insomnia. Typically, once they know they have this or have any clue that this might be happening to them, they're dead within 12 months. Similarly, in rats, so there's been a study on rats where they kept rats awake, just constantly awake. This is Lecture16b and colleagues. They were constantly kept awake without forcing continuous exercise. So this isn't some kind of we're wearing them out. This is partly due to exercise, and they also had control rats that exercised the same amount as the experimental rats. These experimental rats that were just constantly kept awake, they started to look sick, they stopped grooming, they became weak and uncoordinated, they lost their ability to regulate body temperature, just like we saw with people. They began eating more, but were losing weight, and eventually they died. And when they go in and see what was the cause of death is still not understood. They died from lack of sleep. What specifically are the functions of REM sleep? Well, if you told me that it was important for consolidating non-declarative memory, I would tell you that that is extremely important, and that's important for all the animals we can think of, right? How do we perform certain behaviors? That's an important thing to be able to remember when we need to perform that same behavior again. But some of the suggestions here, so one thing we see, the more sleep a person or an animal gets, the higher percentage of that sleep is REM sleep. And he shows us, so the figure over to the right is showing through the lifespan that when we are infants, when we are very young, we're sleeping a great deal. And then a lot of that is REM sleep in the pink-red kind of color. And as we get older, we are sleeping less and less. And it's a smaller and smaller proportion of that is REM sleep. One idea that's out there that I wonder about a bit is just getting oxygen to the cornea. So the idea is, so when our eyes are open, the cornea is getting oxygen from the air around. And then as we close our eyes, it can still receive oxygen from the fluid, that aqueous humor behind it. But as we're asleep and our eyes are still, that fluid becomes stagnant, and so the cornea is not getting oxygen. So one idea is that we're having REM sleep, we're having that rapid eye movements just to get oxygen to the cornea. We might actually wonder then, well, why are we dreaming? Why is anything going on in our brains? Why are we having these intense hallucinations? And there's also some evidence that perhaps that's not the whole answer. We do see the higher percentage of the higher amount, the larger the amount of sleep, the higher percentage of REM sleep. That looks like evidence that so the longer we have this kind of stagnant fluid and no oxygen to the cornea, the more we have to have those eye movements. But so people who take antidepressants, they tend to have less of their proportion of sleep as REM sleep, and it doesn't seem to hurt them in any way. They don't have cornea damage. If we look at biological perspectives on dreaming, if you've taken my personality class, you know that I'm very interested in dreams, and I've even done, in one research methods class, asked some questions about dreams as I was teaching personality at the same time. And many of our personality theorists suggest that there are clues to our personality and who we are and what we're working through, some of the stuff that we're working through in our dreams. But the biological perspectives on dreaming are completely different. One is the activation synthesis hypothesis, that basically we are having this random activation from the pons, and so random activation of various areas of the brain, and we're just trying to synthesize that into something that makes some kind of sense. And because the prefrontal cortex is really low in activity, we do have this lack of real goals, and it jumps around. We can be in one place and then a different place. So there's the synthesis is kind of what the best that we can do with it. The neurocognitive hypothesis suggests that based on our recent memories, we have activation of the brain of the parietal and temporal lobes, and in the not the visual cortex, the V1 itself, but the outer areas of the occipital lobe. And since those are receiving activation without actual sensory input, but really from internal stimulation, that again, it's influenced by our recent memories, and we're really just trying to make sense of and putting together this kind of hallucinatory perception. Okay, next time we'll finish with sleep disorders. I was concerned that I was running a little long. I think I am running just a tiny bit long, but I'll make that up on Friday, and we will start talking about emotional behaviors as much as we can on Friday as well.